Do Muslims and Christians pray to the same God?
What do we mean by the word God? I think that's the question that you have to get to.
We believe in that which was revealed to us and revealed to you. And our God and your God is one and the same. Our differences really is on what we understand that God to be.
What the Quran does is it will take a prophet and it squeezes them into the same structure. But where the problem really happens is, of course, Jesus, because the Quran then tries to squeeze Jesus into that framework and he breaks.
We don't believe that he was crucified and he did not die on the cross.
The crucifixion of Jesus is just about the most certain fact of first century history we actually have.
In the New Testament, Paul himself at one point writes, I say this and not God. But if the whole Bible is the word of God, and the word of God contains a part that says, this is from me and not God, that produces a very fundamental theological contradiction.
It was really only when the Islamic conquests begin and Islam expands out of Arabia, Muslim scholars then began really getting their hands on the scriptures, on the Bible, and engaging with Christians and Jews, and discovered to their horror it was not the same message.
Hello and welcome back to the Unbelievable podcast. I'm Roger Bolton, and the basis for our discussion is a central question of real importance. Do Muslims and Christians pray to the same God? Do they have similar beliefs, as well as differences, of which, of course, we're fairly well aware? Well, I'm delighted to welcome two extremely well-qualified people to talk to us today, Abdullah Al Andalusi and Andy Bannister, and they've been on the program before, of course. We wanted to find out what you wanted to be asked. And you told us that the questions and topics you want more of include the differences between Islam and Christianity, and also questions about the nature of God, identity and politics, and faith and sexuality. So even what it means to be human in the age of AI. So we'll return to some of those issues in later podcasts and try and introduce one or two of those subjects today. I hope we're in for an excellent discussion. We should be, given the nature of our guests. I'm delighted to welcome Abdullah Al Andalusi. He's an international speaker, thinker, and intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. Abdullah is a researcher for the I3 Institute, an instructor and head of the Department of Occidentology at the Qur'an Institute, and co-founder of the discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative, MDI. And joining Abdullah and myself, and also back on the podcast, is Dr. Andy Bannister, a director of SOLAS, a Christian evangelism and training organisation based in Scotland. Andy holds a PhD in Islamic studies and is the author of numerous books debating Christianity, Islam and atheism, and speaks regularly on the intersection between faith and culture. Welcome to you both. It's great to have you back.
It's great to be here, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just before we start, perhaps we could learn a little bit about your own backgrounds and faith backgrounds and journeys. So briefly, Andy, tell me, what has been your faith journey?
Yeah, so very briefly there, Roger. So I grew up in London, in South London, so in very much a Christian home, and I was kind of raised in that tradition. But really, about in my mid-teens, figuring out this was not my faith, this was my mum and dad's faith, and so it was in my mid-teens that really I gave my life to Christ and became a Christian in my own right, in a sense, not just because it was tradition. And then really early on, I think in my sort of late teens, became fascinated about some of the big questions of life, initially through philosophy. That was the kind of first interest that drew me and still does. But really the pathway that set me probably into the discussion we're going into today was 10 or so years later, after those teenage years in my late 20s, began going up to London, to a place called Speaker's Corner, and really beginning to have really in-depth conversations with Muslims there who asked brilliant questions, not questions I'd really encountered before, which really got me thinking hard and beginning to read more widely. And then around that time when I went into theological education, that really carved that pathway out, because I deliberately picked a theological program that had some good sort of stuff on Christian-Muslim relations, and then just sort of kept going. I went into then the PhD years, and it was then very natural, I think, to do my PhD looking at the origins of the Quran, and really sort of fascinating stuff around that. And then since then, that's driven me into the whole world of sort of interfaith discussion, debate, dialogue. I move in that area academically and professionally, as well as as a hobby as well. So that's the kind of sort of view from 30,000 feet. And I've been interested in exploring that both academically and both at a more popular level. So the book today that's going to underpin some of what we talk about is the more popular stuff that I've written, but I've also written at a much sort of higher level academically on Islam as well. And I always love these kind of conversations. So really looking forward to dialoguing with Abdullah in due course.
Right. Well, and Abdullah, what about your faith journey?
Well, my faith journey is I come from actually a Christian background. My mother was Roman Catholic, a nominal Roman Catholic, from a Portuguese background. My father was secular, and I went to a Church of England school. We've had Anglo-Catholic rite. I wouldn't purport to be an expert on Christianity. I converted at 14. I had just some basic understanding of Christianity as much as any 14-year-old would. But I actually started to research more Christianity. Actually, ironically speaking, most of my knowledge of Christianity comes after I converted to Islam. So I found Islam at 14 after starting my search for knowledge at 10 years old. I was a very curious individual. And I looked at different religions, different belief systems, and tried to make sense of it all. And of course, from a young age, I would say that even when I was taught Christianity, I always understood when reading the Bible, having it and also having it read out in school and in mass and so on and so forth. I always got this understanding that there's Jesus and then there's God, and Jesus is servant of God. He prays to God. And so I think every child, I think most Christian children growing up actually see a difference between God and Jesus. And that's actually even replicated also in Portugal itself. I've actually had weird, strange, surreal debates as a Muslim with Catholic friends of mine who would swear to me that Jesus is not part of the Trinity and he's not God, but a servant of God and just the Son of God. And I've had to say, well, actually, that's not Catholic doctrine. And so it's very surreal debate. So I don't want to actually win this debate with you because I actually believe that Jesus is a servant of God and a human being fully. But that was the kind of process of Christianity I kind of grew up in. And then I embraced Islam. And as I continued in my studies and so on, obviously, before I even became a Muslim, I actually prayed to God and asked God to give me guidance. And if God was to guide me to the truth, I would then proclaim it to the world. And in a way, all my further activities have been in service to that promise I made. And so I set up an organization that does Muslim debates with other religions, worldviews, and so on and so forth. As well as, I do public lectures on a variety of topics. I used to start off actually doing debates with Christians of different denominations. But now I mostly focus on, you could say, political or topical issues or political philosophy, engaging with liberals and secularists and so on, with the occasional atheists sprinkled in there for good measure.
Well, crikey, put me in the shade here with the breadth of your knowledge already. And I won't ask you to represent the whole of Christianity and the whole of Islam, of course, because everybody is, as you've just demonstrated, very individual and particular. But let's start on the question of similarities between the faith, or what are supposed to be similarities. I think a lot of people will know, or will have heard the expression, we're all the children of Abraham, and that we worship the same God. We worship one God. So, Andy, is the God you worship the same God then as Abdullah worships?
Oh my word! What an amazing question, Roger. And one of the challenges is straight away. It's one of those questions. So many questions in life sound really simple on the outside, but then when you unpack them, you have to break them down to a whole variety of questions. I mean, one thing you've illustrated straight away because you've said, Andy, you don't represent the whole of Christianity. Abdullah can't represent every flavor of Islam. As one of my Muslim friends once said to me, where 2 or 3 Muslims are gathered, we have 19 different opinions. There are Islams rather than just one Islam with differences, a whole variety of things. So, but we take the big question. We're talking about God. A couple of things I think emerge immediately. Well, first question is, of course, what do we mean by the word God? I think that's the question that you have to get to. I think one reason there is so much confusion in today's world around these issues, Roger, is that we use the word God and we don't unpack what it means. And in the book I've written on this, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? One of the things I do is lift the lid on that question and say, well, okay, let's look at the Qur'an and how it describes God. Let's look at the Bible and how it describes God, and look for characteristics that run over, in the Bible's case, 2,000 years of revelation, and then line those up with the Quran.
But is one of the distinctions here that you think it is possible to know that both Muslims and Christians believe in one God, not many gods, in one God. But is the difference here, Abdullah, that you do not believe that God is knowable, and that Andy perhaps thinks God is knowable through the Bible? If I asked you, Abdullah, to define God, would you be able to?
Well, firstly, in terms of, I suppose, answering a question that you said to Andy, which is, I believe that we all worship the same God, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Anyone that has ever worshipped one God who is above creation, doesn't resemble anything in creation, is the first and the one who created all things, worships the same God I do. Whether you want to call this God Shangdi, or you want to call this Ptah, or you want to call this God Tanri, or what have you. These are all ancient names for kind of a head god, or you might say. But what humans have done is corrupted it by adding other gods alongside this, and then making this god into a head god, and with family relations with children. Usually they add children to it, daughters, sons, and so on and so forth. So, and this is kind of borne out in the verse of the Quran, which just mentions that we worship the same God. I just want to put that down just to show the Muslim position, because Islam is one of the, well, I suppose one of the few religions that actually addresses the other religions that had came before. So here's what it says: and do not argue with the followers of earlier revelation, except in a way that is best, except for those who commit injustice amongst them, and say, we believe in that which was revealed to us and revealed to you. And our God and your God is one and the same, and it is unto him that we all surrender ourselves. So we all believe in the same God. Even the Catholic, of a recent Vatican Council affirmed as well that Muslims also worship the same God as Christians, and Jews and Jewish sages like Maimonides affirm that Muslims worship the same God that Jews do. So we all affirm we worship the same God. Our differences really is on what we understand that God to be, and essence, nature, and so on and so forth. And that's where the differences lie. But it doesn't mean you're not worshiping the same thing. Like ancients had difference of opinion as to what the sun was.
So, Andy, if there are differences of views about the nature of God within Christianity, does it make sense to say Christians and Muslims broadly believe in the same God?
Well, with the very greatest respect to our Muslim friend, I don't think you can do that without first damaging what the word God means. And that's one of the biggest issues in here. Yes, absolutely. If you say, well, there's one God who created everything and he's above space and time, and look, therefore we worship the same thing, that's such a minimalist view of God. I don't think there's much content in there is the first thing. Second thing I think is important that I didn't touch on in my previous answer to you, that phrase Abrahamic faiths also does a huge amount of work. The Quran, as we now know through sort of critical work on, early Islam, what happened in the formative period of the Quran in the 600s was Muhammad, as he preached and taught orally what became the Quran, borrowed, picked up a lot of Christian and Jewish ideas, terms that was sloshing around the Arabia of the day, because there were Jewish and Christian groups there. And that's why you get names like Abraham and Jesus and so forth sort of turn up in the Quran. But it's a massive mistake, and this is really not a controversial position, actually. It's a massive mistake to assume, therefore, because the Quran mentions Abraham, it's an Abrahamic faith. In the same way that if you sat down in your study tomorrow, Roger, invented a new religion and just wrote Abraham into it a couple of times, we would be daft to say Roger's new religion is an Abrahamic faith, because there is no organic connection between Islam. Judaism and Christianity are sister religions. Most of the first Christians were Jews. The New Testament quotes the Old Testament 2,000 times. It's the same theological system, very closely knitted together. Islam starts 600 years later, 1,000 miles away. None of those organic connections. And so most of the more recent critical work on the origin of Islam has really come to appreciate what you have is a very Arabian faith in terms of its theological systems, the way it functions, with a sort of veneer of Christian and Jewish language on top. And so much confusion. I think Islamic studies actually has been held back for decades, if not a century or two, by that confusion, because Christians often was Christians working on critical Islamic studies, just sort of brought their Christian framework and read it through that lens. Thankfully, we're sort of out those woods and out the other side. And that's my other concern, I guess, is when you jam things together, you risk damaging both Christianity and Islam rather than sit down afresh and go, okay, Muslims and Christians agree there is a God behind the universe. Let's just pause, and now let's flesh some content out into that.
It's not just, I say, Abraham. Islam recognizes a number of prophets, who we would normally have thought of associating only with Judaism or Christianity.
Yes.
They recognize Noah, Moses, David, Joseph, John the Baptist. Now, what they recognize them as, you doubtless will have a different view, but that they accord them the title of prophets. You would agree with that?
Absolutely. And one of the things the Quran does, by the way, that's really quite interesting, and just I will, through the course of this, maybe wave a few books at people, because I know you've got a very bright listenership there. If you take a look at Mark Dury's classic book, The Quran and Its Biblical Reflexes, probably the best academic study in the last 3 or 4 years, looking at what the Quran has done there. And what the Quran does is, for actually all biblical prophets, actually, it will take a prophet and it squeezes them into the same structure. So basically, each Quranic prophet looks largely the same. God sends a prophet to a people. The prophet faces resistance, but then overcomes that by the help of God. And that structure is applied to every biblical prophet. Everything is flattened. That's one reason, by the way, in the Quran, why chronology is sort of not there. So if you try and work out the order that prophets appear in the Quran, who came before who, pretty much impossible. And then, of course, what's interesting, when Muhammad's biography gets created and written up in the centuries following, it's sort of squeezed into the same framework. But where the problem really happens is, of course, Jesus, because the Quran then tries to squeeze Jesus into that framework, and he breaks. It was interesting that Abdullah, in his little introduction, mentioned kind of Jesus and the Islamic Jesus, and boy, there's some fascinating conversations to have there. But I think the Quran breaks when it comes to the person of Jesus.
Yeah, well, we're leaping ahead to Jesus. I'd like to stay at the moment with the question of these other prophets. Abdullah, for the moment, let's leave, as it were, the question of God aside, and again, trying to look for similarities between the faiths. Islam recognizes a number of prophets that obviously Christians and Jews do. Noah, Abraham, we've mentioned Moses, David, Joseph, John the Baptist, and so on. But when we say Islam recognizes them as prophets, what do we mean by that? What do you mean by that if you were to call Moses a prophet?
Well, a prophet is, there's in Islam, we have two concepts, a prophet and messenger. So a prophet is someone who has been chosen by God to guide his people according to God's commandments. A messenger is one that is a prophet and also brings a message, brings commandments and directions for humanity, usually for a people locally. So this is what a messenger is. So we say that Musa, as in Arabic, Musa alayhi salam, is a messenger and a prophet. So he was there to guide, but also he brings a message from God and then guides according to it. So the prophets would explicate and would explain things according to the message, but would also explain what was going on in society. Almost, you could say in modern terms, almost like someone who's a social political commentator, but guided by God to basically explain the problems in society, where it comes from, why things are happening to that people, if it's bad things or good things, and explaining it in relation to the purpose that God has for that people. So this is what being a prophet generally does, and is meant to be an upright model for the people to follow, a model of righteousness. So this is basically what we'd understand by prophet.
But there's another thing, if I may say so.
Yeah.
Say, for example, with the Moses, there's another element here, isn't there? The Christian belief that some, anyway, of the prophets are saying or laying the way for Jesus. And in fact, people would say there's a specific reference in Moses which talks about Jesus, though not named. But your view of a prophet wouldn't be an element of your view of a prophet, would it?
Well, it depends what you mean by laying the way for Jesus. So if you're talking about, for example, allusions to what Jews might interpret to be a Messiah coming, an anointed person, or Elijah, then this is obviously something that might be found in texts, whereas the oral Torah or the actual Torah or the Tanakh. But whether it's laying the way for God to incarnate as a human being and be sacrificed for the sins of mankind is something that Jews would expressly disagree on and say that that's basically Christian eisegesis into the Hebrew Bible, which in no way says that the Messiah will come and die. Messiah, one of the measures of a successful Messiah, the one who is successful claiming to a Messiah, is that he actually won't die. He'll live. And what's even further egregious is that to argue that God, who's described as the ever-living, could possibly die. Right? So anything, I mean, even the Old Testament, as Christians call it, or the Hebrew Bible, actually produces that as a refutation, that if someone believes they are God, then how is it they actually can die if they actually are God? It was actually a refutation to a haughty prince.
Can I just hold you there a moment, because I do want to obviously go on to the question of the nature of Jesus, but at the moment we were just talking about the prophets and the extent to which they were both relaying messages of God to the Jewish people, but also to a degree foreshadowing the Messiah. Of course, when we even raise the question of Messiah, we have to define that again, because a Jewish understanding of the Messiah would be very different from a Christian one. Indeed, one of the perplexing things for Christians, I think, is how long the disciples took to understand that Jesus was not, as it were, a conventional Messiah in that terms that the Jews were apparently expecting, someone who would come and presumably restore Israel and presumably get rid of the Roman occupation, and so on and so on. And Jesus had to talk about a very different concept of Messiah. So, Abdullah, what's the concept of a Messiah in Islam?
Well, the Messiah, or as it literally means anointed one, is one that was meant to give guidance and offer redemption to the Israelites who had become wayward, right, and offer them a way back so they can repent from them for their sins. And this is what the function of prophets generally do: is that they guide their peoples. They go to lost cities, places like Nineveh and so on. They try to guide them back, like Jonah and many others. That's the point of prophets, is to guide humanity back into a relationship with God as the servants of God, those who love God, and those who repent to God and avail themselves of His mercy. I don't think we really touched upon a lot of the similarities between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, but obviously Islam and Judaism have quite a lot of similarities. But the first thing I'd often would like to tell Christian audiences that whenever you hear the word Allah mentioned, because you're speaking a Germanic language, and hence the word for God you use is a German word like Gott, it sounds strange and weird. But if Jesus was around today and he heard the word Allah, he would recognize it as a Semitic word. In any of the Semitic languages, Aramaic, Assyrian, or Hebrew, the word for God is spelled exactly the same way, which is ALH, right? It might be pronounced slightly differently, but it's always pronounced the same way. So Allah is just the Arabic word for God.
Andy, picking up that idea of Messiah, then, to what extent, of course, the Jews would have seen a Messiah in a different way that Christians do. Do you think that the Muslim perspective or view of a Messiah is quite close to a Jewish one rather than a Christian one?
Good question. Let me say a few things here. Let's try and keep it on track, because I was sitting there thinking we could have a wonderful diversion into linguistics, and especially when we get to terms like Isa, the Islamic name for Jesus. There's a lot of scholarly literature around Allah and its origins and its etymology and so on. Let's not go there. Let's stick on Messiah. Is interesting because Messiah is very interesting, actually, Roger, because the Quran uses the term Messiah for Jesus. It's one of many unique titles of Jesus in the Quran, which is an issue we may come to later. But it was a term that caused early Islamic scholars a huge headache, because the Quran regularly takes a term that it's been picked up from Jewish and Christian theology. Again, because we described earlier how that oral milieu in which Islam, the early Quran, came together, terms, ideas were picked up, and often the theology behind them was lost. That's what happens, by the way, when ideas come through oral tradition. You tend to lose the bits behind them. It's one reason why the Quran lacks dates and geographical information. Classic example of what happens when you percolate through oral tradition. And the term Messiah was one of those. The Quran borrows the term, doesn't really have a theology behind it, doesn't really understand it. And when you trace that through early Islamic commentary on their own Quran. It's phenomenal, the number of different opinions you get. My fun fact for you for the show is that you get to the 14th century, and the Iranian Muslim scholar Al-Farazabadi, who was a linguist, thought it would be an interesting exercise to go back and see how many understandings, different definitions of the word Messiah in previous Islamic literature he could come up with. And he found something like 50 different understandings, of which my favourite being flat-footed. And by the way, that comes from The Muslim Jesus by Tarif Khalidi.
Well, Abdullah, do you accept that that Islam has very many definitions of Messiah in the way that Andy has just suggested?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't say that these are problematic to have slightly different interpretations, but we all agree, all Muslims generally agree, that the word Messiah means the anointed one. It's etymologically, that's what the word means. And it refers to a prophet and messenger. We all agree on that. All Muslims agree on that very basic thing. As to what additional meanings come about from that, well, even Jews have the difference of opinion as to the term Messiah, and even Christians do as well, to some extent, as to what the intent of the word Messiah. So there's to say that I think it's a little bit of a red herring. I mean, to argue that the Quran doesn't have dates or historiographic information written into it, that's a problem. I think I should relate that to, I suppose, the problem is that he's comparing the Quran with a human-made product, which is basically a collection of history chronological writings, which is written by human beings. Human beings, they bring all things together, they systematically try to date and things, although sometimes inaccurately. And they produce a historiographical, work. So they talk about chronologies and sagas and legends. Whereas the Quran would be more better compared to the Psalms in the Bible. No one said that the Psalms are problematic because they don't contain historiographical information or dating. The Quran is meant to be a message from God that's timeless. It's not meant to give you dates and times. And according to which calendar would it give you dates and time? Which universal calendar that all human beings will follow? Or which universal language must it be introduced in to be, these are the issues which I think are non-issues there. So the Psalms are in Hebrew.
Well, Andy, I'll just bring briefly Andy in at this point, who's shaking his head.
That's a common response. I need to respond on the two things. Firstly, the chronology. It's not that the Quran doesn't contain that. I agree. I can absolutely accept, Abdullah. It could be that it's like the Psalms, which, by the way, do contain some chronological, contextual information. You can do that. You can do that study if you wish to. It's more that the Quran, I think, has extracted things from their historical context and caused some problems along the way. I mentioned earlier, and I will mention again because it's such a useful read. Anyone listening wants to go further, take a look at Tarif Khalidi, Muslim scholar, Cambridge University at the time, book The Muslim Jesus. It's got a lovely introductory essay in there where he makes the point, and he raises a problem, actually, even though he's a Muslim. He says the Quran, when it comes to Jesus, has created a kind of meta-historical Jesus. It's abstracted him from history, lost those kind of backgrounds, and thus, he kind of floats around coming out with sort of theological pronouncements with no context to them. And it does cause some damage, I think, if you take things out of their order. So, for example, the reader of the Quran could easily end up assuming that Moses and Jesus were near contemporaries. But the Messiah bit, Roger, is important because I think what it reflects, and I think Al-Farazabadi, who I told you about earlier, what it reflects, is time and time again, the Quran will take a term and an idea, and because, and obviously in this case, I presume, Muhammad there in the 7th century heard Christians referring to Jesus in this way, borrows that term without understanding the background behind it, then you end up with kind of theological problems. Problem number one, for example, the Messiah comes at the end of the prophetic sequence. That's basically what it means to be the Messiah. You have the prophets point forward and head towards the Messianic age. You do not have another great prophet after the Messiah. So in one sense, if Jesus is the Messiah, that doesn't leave a room for someone like Muhammad. That's a sort of theological error. That's a sort of 404 error page.
I want to pick up on the nature of Jesus and the similarities and differences that exist. But just to summarize where we are, and I actually won't ask you to agree with this because I don't think I can summarize it adequately. But anyway, if we could say that Muslims and Christians believe in one God. They believe in a range of prophets together. They believe in a Messiah. But the nature of that is heavily disputed, and we'll pick up the question of the nature of Jesus in just a moment. We'll just need to take a quick break. Please let us know what you think. You can email us on unbelievable@premier.org.uk or track with us on social media at Unbelievable FE for X and at Premier Unbelievable for Instagram, or facebook.com/Premier Unbelievable. We'll be back in just a moment.
I really don't think that AI as it is now is on a trajectory to becoming conscious, but it will certainly seem as though machines have conscious minds, and that's a danger.
If consciousness is a property of the brain, then it's subject to what we call causal determinism, physical determinism.
This idea of libertarian free will, I think, is entirely wrong, and I also think is unnecessary.
These systems will become more and more like us. People will treat them and want them to be treated as though they're human. The challenge now is it seems to be going faster and faster.
We are terrible at projecting out long-term consequences.
Robot rights, I can see it coming.
Welcome back. You're listening to an Unbelievable podcast, and today we have a former Christian, now Muslim, Abdullah Al Andalusi, in discussion with former atheist, now Christian writer and apologist, Andy Bannister. And in the second section of this podcast, I promised that we'd begin anyway by talking about the nature of Jesus and to the extent to which both faiths can recognize or agree on some things. Abdullah, let's start with the conception of Jesus. You believe, I think Muslims do believe, in a virginal conception, a miraculous conception. You believe that Jesus was miraculously conceived of a virgin. Isn't that correct?
Yes, we do believe in that. I'd also like to point out that, and just to kind of respond to what Andy said previously, the Messiah is very important because he does come at the end of the prophetic line for the Israelites. So he's the last Israelite prophet from amongst them. It doesn't mean he's the last prophet or messenger of God for humanity, full stop. Right? But he is significant, and he's also significant because he's actually, in a way, the last prophet standing on earth, because we believe he will come back. We believe there'll be a second coming of Jesus, and he will lead the Muslim nation. He will lead the Muslims and be the leader of the Muslims. So this is what we believe. And so in a sense, at the end of human history, he's going to be present. So hence, he's quite significant. And the word Messiah is to single him out. Is not a prophet, not a messenger, but he takes these very pivotal roles as being the last of a line of Israelite prophets, and also the last prophet that will be that will be living on earth, because obviously, although he was born before the Prophet Muhammad, we believe that he'll have a second coming, and he will be the last prophet amongst human beings, because the Prophet Muhammad has already passed. So, and I think this is why it's important.
God, sorry to interrupt. Quran, I think, also says that God raised Jesus to himself.
Yes, which is again, it parallels some of the accounts of early Christians who said something similar to this. But I would say that there is, as I said, as Muslims, we have a love of Jesus. We have to affirm that he's the Messiah. We have to affirm that he's a prophet, messenger of God. We must love Jesus. If we don't, we're not Muslim. So this is something that Jesus is quite very important for Islamic belief. His name is mentioned quite often, or a reference to him is mentioned, like the Messiah, son of Mary, is mentioned quite often in the Quran, and his mother is venerated and honored in the Quran and in the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is an important thing.
And also, just sorry to interrupt again, but also you believe, Muslims believe that Jesus was crucified, but that he did not die on the cross.
No, so we don't believe, generally speaking, the mainstream opinion amongst Muslims that he was not at all crucified, and he did not die on the cross. So he didn't die, and this is actually a great rebuttal to those who, from the Jewish faith, who believe that Jesus is not the Messiah because the Messiah is not meant to die, and they argue that, well, the fact that he died showed that he's not the Messiah. just, whether you claim he came back from the dead afterwards is neither here nor there. The Messiah will not actually die in the first place until he's achieved his mission. What we say.
So you believe that Jesus did not die on the cross and that he was taken up by God to heaven.
That he wasn't even crucified. And there are some early Christian sects that also believe that he wasn't crucified and so on, which is a different discussion which I won't go into. But what I will say is that some of the things that Andy Bannister may level at Islam as being some kind of newcomer that just appropriated doctrines from a religion he didn't fully understand is the same arguments that Jews make against his faith, his religion. They could point to argument points like, for example, I think it was Paul referenced that Jesus it was prophesied in the early text in the Jewish Bible that the Messiah will come from Nazareth, but there is no such text that says that. So I
need to come back on some of this.
He got that wrong. Roger. So the point is that they make the same argument against Jesus and Christianity. The early Christians didn't understand the religion. They appropriate the concepts from Judaism.
Well, Andy's shaking his head, but Andy, please don't pursue that point if you wouldn't, because I want to pursue something with you. That therefore,
just hold this. No,
sorry. On this point, which is it is Christian belief. It is essential that Jesus was crucified and died. That's non-negotiable, isn't it? And just explain why you think it is an essential element of faith.
I just need to put a footnote under the other thing. One footnote. This is not the same argument, because the argument I was making was actually a purely anthropological one. Yet that you are absolutely right, Abdullah, that Christians and Jews have many differences, but anthropologically, not even theologically. Where the argument now is in academia is that Christianity and Judaism are deeply, deeply related. All the first Christians were Jews, largely. New Testament quotes the Old 2,000 times. They are very, very closely symbiotically related, even if there is profound disagreement. Islam, 600 years later, 1,000 miles away, an underlying Arabian framework. Again, for people who want to chase me up on this.
Okay. Yeah, I know you've held that book up before, but Andy, I want to make this point, that because a lot of people will be, perhaps Christians who didn't know, surprised that to hear from Muslims that they believe Jesus did not die on the cross.
Yes.
Christians don't say that this is a matter of history, whatever. They say it's a matter of essential and intentional purpose, that it is a necessary thing. Why is it so necessary to Christians that Jesus did die?
Well, the trouble is you're asking two questions combined, so I'll have a crack at both of them. There's the historical question and the theological question. Historically, as one atheist historian, of repute remarked, he said, the crucifixion of Jesus is just about the most certain fact of first century history we actually have. And it's interesting that I noticed Abdullah sort of alluded to it and then did a screaming handbrake turn, because what's often happened in Islam is you get additions like the substitution legend, because Muslims really, who know their history, have to deal with someone being put on the cross. And so many Muslims, not necessarily Abdullah, but many Muslims would believe that Allah magically made somebody else look like Jesus, and that substitute was crucified to solve the problems. So historically, we have the crucifixion of Jesus, where we are an incredibly certain ground for a whole number of reasons, and many friends I have in academia who are purely secular historians would go, well, of course, that's obvious. Then for Christians, why do we believe this matters? Firstly, it matters because it's central to Jesus's ministry and teaching. Jesus predicted his own death multiple times, directly in some cases to his disciples, telling them what he was going up to Jerusalem to do, and then indirectly, so many of the parables of Jesus' teaching, which are not found, of course, in the Quran. The Quran says that Jesus taught, but doesn't retell any of that teaching. Later on, you have to read early Islamic theologians who then begin mining that stuff. But things like the parable of the talents in the vineyard and other stories. So Jesus, time and time again, predicted that was what he was going to do. Said that was what he was going to do.
But also, in terms of why many Christians believe it was necessary, it's because of the theory of atonement, isn't it? That it was necessary. I was going to say the reason, Roger, we need to get it this way around is there's this huge mistake that happens in all of these conversations, and the same thing befalls Islam. To be fair to our Muslim friends, run into the same thing. That if you put the theological horse the theological cart
before the historical horse, you end up in problems. The reason the first Christians believed in things like the atonement and the resurrection and those kind of things was not because they had some cleverly worked out theology that they they then bolted the stories onto. What I like is, it was interesting, if you look at the resurrection accounts in the New Testament, they are very, very light on theology. The first Christians were stunned by the fact that Jesus had risen from the dead, and then the rest of the New Testament is really unpacking that question of why that happened. And yes, you're absolutely right. At the heart of the Christian faith is that understanding that we cannot bear our own burden of sin. Actually, one of the few verses in the Quran I agree with is the verse that says, no bearer of burdens can bear the burden of another. But that we cannot earn our way into God's good purposes, into God's plans by our sheer good deeds, as Muhammad himself, by the way, acknowledged.
Well, Abdullah, just coming to you on this point about the crucifixion and so on, one of the difficulties I think Muslims have is the idea that it seems to them it's contradictory to suggest that Jesus, on the one hand, is one with God, a member of the Trinity, and yet can die. Is that a real stumbling block for Muslims?
Well, I think it's a stumbling block for Jews as well, and the fact that the Old Testament has an argument against someone who believes that they were there's this haughty prince who believed that he was God, and then it argues, will you still believe you're God when you're dying, basically when you die? So it argues that one of the great refutations for a human being God, is that they die. So if this is the same author, the same one who sent Jesus, it wouldn't make sense for the author behind this argument to then say to humanity that you should believe now a human being who dies is also God at the same time, as despite the fact that the refutation was used that if you die, you're not God. So this is and God is not the author of confusion. Not a biblical quote down there for you. But what I would say is, as I said, some of what Andy has said about Islam could also apply more so to Christianity. Christianity came 2,000 years after, or more after Moses, and it's quite a later thing, quote unquote. And if you want to bring an anthropological explanation, and by that a secular one, I suppose, one that tries to explain things purely from a non miraculous basis, then the same argument could be laid, in fact, perhaps more so at the feet of Christianity. And this also forms the basis of disagreement between Islam and Christianity. Many historians believe, and I think there's a basis for this, is that a lot of the Christian doctrines which are different between Islam and Judaism, and I want to emphasize that Islam and Judaism actually have virtually identical theological concepts in terms of doing good deeds and having faith. So faith and works, also in the book of James as well. Early Christians in Jerusalem believe faith and works is what's required for salvation. But we see with this Greco-Roman thought and ideas like Neoplatonism, the idea that there's, in essence, kind of like a cosmology is explained by these three entities, right? And then it came into Christianity as the Trinity. The original sin, the death of Dionysus, killed by the Titans, upon which humans are made from the Titans. So they bear the sin of the killing of Dionysius. We see the idea that the Holy Spirit is the only one that can change your heart and make you a perfect human being, is a great response to the Stoics, and saying that you can, by your own discipline, you can make yourself righteous and good and so on and so forth. So what we see is this development of Christianity to fit into the Roman Greco milieu, appeal to common concepts and ideas which were Greco-Roman, and to argue that Christianity does it better. Christianity is the ideal of the Greco-Roman ideal. And also, as I said, as for the crucifixion issue, which I think you referenced, usually whenever you have a Christian sect or cult or something, some individual that claims to be a prophet like Joseph Smith from the Mormons later on, no Christian originated sect or faction would ever deny the Bible or deny a key concept of the Bible. Every Christian you'd ever meet, every Christian the Prophet Muhammad would have probably ever met, would have said that they believe that Jesus was crucified. They believe he was crucified and he died. Right? It wouldn't be controversial, Islamically speaking, just to accept that and say, because prophets die, it's not a problem for in Islam. But why must then the Quran say if the Quran is meant to be proposing from is a forgery or what have you, as maybe Andy Bannister might posit, why actually say no?
By the way,
no, it is.
No, to be fair, he wouldn't say it's a forgery.
I wouldn't use that word. I think it's a fascinating piece of 7th century literature that tells you an awful lot about what was going on in that period of time theologically. We can come to that. Carry
fine.
on.
Well, I mean, in essence, it's not from God, right? I think you would argue that. That's what your position. So the question is, why then, if you're trying to appeal to Christians, would you deny what is commonly accepted amongst Christians at the time? It wouldn't make any sense unless the author of the Quran knows something that we don't, right? A false prophet would just appeal to what is commonly said. They wouldn't go out of the way, because it now makes it harder to convince Christians to say that Jesus wasn't crucified, right? But again, it would make the Islamic case stronger if we, in some ways, you could say, to say that Jesus did die. That would show that he's not God at all. But we said he didn't even die in the first place, right? And that can only be said with such a surety, with such confidence, if the author of the Quran knows something about what really happened that we do, and we don't. And the first ends with saying that we do nothing, but the people around there only guess. They only assume. They don't have certainty as to what happened.
But you see, I was trying to get at, Abdullah, was I think the Christian faith would argue this isn't. Well, he might or he might not. It depends on the historical record. They would argue that actually Jesus had to die because without that, then humanity would not have the possibility of renewing itself. The language rather escapes me, really. But I mean, essentially, we would not be redeemed if Jesus had not died on the cross. Therefore, it's not a question for Christians of an historical record so much as a necessary event. Am I, Andy? Is that a fair but inadequate summary?
Yeah, this is a really tough conversation because we're pivoting from history and now we're swinging into theology for me. So we need to talk about some of the history just for a moment here, just as an aside, because I want to make sure that people hear both sides of this for a moment. It's important. So Abdullah's point is very interesting there. Your comment about the early development of Christian doctrine, fascinating, with every due respect, about 60 years too late. Now there's much more of an understanding in New Testament studies that the term that's used, if you want the terminology, is early high Christology. And what happened, there was really a revolution, I would say, in New Testament studies, both inside the Christian world and also in the university, probably around about the sort of 1980s into the 1990s, when we really discovered as scholars just how thoroughly Jewish the earliest understanding of Jesus is in the New Testament. So take someone like Richard Bauckham, real giant in theological studies. His book, God Crucified, that came out around about 1990 something. I should have the date to hand. Really interesting again. When you actually look at the New Testament and use Jewish theological categories, the highest Christology in the entire of the New Testament is the very, very earliest stuff. Go read something like Philippians 2 that dates the 40s, or if not earlier. Go read Mark's Gospel. I remember doing a debate with Shabir Ali, very well-known Muslim apologist and speaker in Canada a few years ago. I lived in Canada, and Shabir and I became sort of friends. Lovely man, and we had many disagreements over the years. And in the debate that he and I had, I just took him through Mark's Gospel. You don't need to go to the later.
Yeah, but sorry, that's not a contradiction, if I may. So for what Abdullah
is saying, I'm just addressing the developmental point because I think
yes, but a lot of people would have said, a lot of scholars would say, particularly when they look at the meeting at the Council of Jerusalem, when you have Paul and Peter,
yes,
where you have Peter still locked into, many people would think, or at least the Christian community in Jerusalem at that time, still locked into a Jewish, essentially seeing Jesus as an extension or a development of the Jewish faith. And the influence that comes with St. Paul from the classical world, which brings
I think I was going to say, let's pick up on that. I think that,
so what I'm saying is, sorry, to complete the thought, that what Abdullah is saying and what you're saying are compatible because...
Yes, I suppose, depending on how far you stretch the term compatible. What is interesting, by the way, on that Greek point as well, again, and I think you've had him on Unbelievable, actually, if you go read Tom Holland's massive book Dominion. Tom's long been a friend of Premier, right? So, secular historian at the point he wrote that. I mean, I think Tom's point is really interesting because that book was an eye-opener to me in just how much actually the Christian faith turned the Greco-Roman world upside down. I mean, the clue actually is in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 23, where Paul says that the crucifixion
but that is
is
Paul,
a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to
keep
the Greeks.
making the case, which was this, that essentially the early Christians after the immediate death of Jesus, or many of them, did not seem to see that the faith was for the world. They still saw it essentially as a Jewish faith, and without the influence of Paul.
That's the point.
Right. Okay. Well, so where we appear now to be is the view about Jesus as a prophet, Abdullah. But where is he, if you like, in your view, the greatest prophet except for Muhammad? Do we see him, in your view, as almost the final stage before the ultimate and complete revelation in the Quran of Muhammad?
Well, the Quran actually tells Muslims to not make distinctions between prophets. So we love all the prophets equally. Obviously, some we know better about than others. Some are not named. Not all the prophets that God has sent down to mankind obviously are named in the Quran, or indeed possibly even the Bible. So this is something that we don't pick favorites, you could say. But if you see, obviously, reference to what Jesus is alleged to have described his mission as, that he said, "I've only been sent to the lost sheep of Israel," whereas the Prophet Muhammad said, to paraphrase, that he was sent as a mercy to all mankind. And so, as the last prophet and messenger from the creator of the universe, his mission must be more universal than simply just the lost sheep of Israel. And that would describe the difference between, in terms of the scope of the Prophet Muhammad's mission and Jesus' mission as described in the Bible, but I would say also affirmed to an extent by Quranic text about his mission, and there is a lot of Quranic text that describe the mission of Jesus, which obviously I could go into.
Now, you've said quite a lot about the Bible, in your view, being a collection of stories written over various periods, pieces of history, and so on. And but it is your view, and it's all Muslims' view, that the Quran, together with the Hadith, the sayings, this is a final revelation. There isn't a continued revelation, is there, in Islam? This is almost an end point. This is the complete revelation. Is that right?
Well, I would like to say that the Bible and the Quran are not really compatible, because there is a type of literature that we have in Islam which is compatible, which it would be comparable, with the Bible, and that was, we call it seerah literature, which is the writings about the life of the Prophet Muhammad and what he did, his actions and sayings. That's more similar to the Gospels. As for St. Paul's writings, which are just his own letters, this is not our literature would only be maybe comparable to late scholars that came after the time of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad who wrote about the Prophet Muhammad. And so these scholarly texts, in essence, would be more comparable to, quote unquote, St. Paul, who himself admitted that he never met Jesus in the flesh, did not learn his doctrines from anybody. So this is, which I think forms roughly half the New Testament, give or take, depending on scholarly disputes on the matter. So so the fact that the Quran is the word of God, and a friend of mine pointed out to me, actually, quite interestingly, that nowhere in the Bible does the Bible say it is the word of God, whereas the Quran actually says it is the word of God. And that kind of describes the difference, really, which is that the previous text had been through human hands. When I say texts, rather, these are just the recorded sayings of the Prophet of Jesus. Some we don't know if they're fully remembered correctly. A lot of them, there are differences. There are disputable issues. There are various versions that have come out. There are texts we discovered were not actually accurate, and then these texts later on became doctored and changed, or had different versions. So we don't know for absolute certain what the Jesus actually did say. For absolute certain, only relying on Christian texts. But the mission of the Quran was to be something that was not coming through human hands, proverbially speaking, and would be coming direct from God, and would explain what was true in the previous revelations. So it's described as a muhaymin in Arabic.
Sorry, to be clear, what essentially the prophet is doing then is not writing his understanding of God. He is God is directly transmitting through him the word of God. So in that sense, all the Prophet, all Muhammad is doing at that point is writing down. He's not inventing it, or rather thinking it through. Andy, would you like to reply to the specific suggestion, some of the claims that have been made by Abdullah, not for the Quran, but if you like, for the Bible itself, about not, for example, saying it is the word of
yes,
God?
I mean, it's in one sense, where do you begin? Because some of the sort of cartload of inaccuracies. Let's begin at the beginning with the Quran, because the Quran actually in numerous places affirms the Bible. Time and time again, Muslims are told to ask the people of the book. The Quran, Muhammad, if Muhammad is the person in question, in a verse like sort of Surah 5, verse 48, is literally told that which is between your hands, is scripture, and so on and so forth. Now, what gets interesting, when you look for the first 150 to 200 years of Islam, that was taken as a given. Early Muslim scholars did not pull an Abdullah and start criticizing and nitpicking and so on, partly, I think, because they saw the theological problem. Because if you believe in a God who is so incompetent he can't preserve his scripture, you have a little bit of a problem. What happens, though, when Islam begins in Arabia there in the 7th century, the Bible had not been, well, possibly not yet translated, but certainly not widely disseminated in Arabic. Muhammad was quite probably illiterate, an oral performer. In fact, my PhD thesis, published in my first academic book, really looked at the signs of that oral composition in the Quran, and that's now been picked up by numerous other scholars working in that field. So it was really only when the Islamic conquests begin and Islam expands out of Arabia, along North Africa, up into Spain, where, Abdullah, your surname, of course, comes from, and so on, that Muslim scholars then began really getting their hands on the scriptures, on the Bible, and engaging with Christians and Jews, and discovered to their horror it was not the same message. And it's from that period that this doctrine, this Muslim belief that you now hear very commonly emerges, that the Bible has been corrupted. But if you look at scholars like Camilla Adang and others who've done work in that area, looking at early Muslim attitudes to the Bible, it all shifted around that time when Islam sort of became a bit confident and entered the period of empire. We Brits had an empire, we forget Muslims had a massive empire. They were a great imperial nation too. So I think you actually end up in massive theological problems, incidentally, once you start as a Muslim trying to pull the Bible to pieces like that. And one other thought, just as a side note, we need to be careful when we use the term the Quran, because when Muhammad was preaching orally, that which then got written down, memorized, written on scraps of flint, and all the other sort of ideas that we have in the Hadith, the idea that the Quran was a cohesive whole, that's a later idea. There's this constant pattern in Islam, and with respect, Abdullah, I think you're falling into the elephant trap of assuming that Islamic theology, including the Quran as you know it, sort of fully formed.
Well, Abdullah, do you accept that you fall into an elephant trap there?
Not at all. I don't know if Andy Bannister, I wouldn't presume his understanding of Islamic text, but the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is recorded to himself have said to Muslims, not to, when talking about the people of the book and their beliefs and their scriptures, not to disbelieve in any of it and not to believe in any of it. For you may disbelieve in something which is true, and you may believe in something that is false. That was a fraud that came later. So the Prophet Muhammad himself defined the Muslim policy towards the text of Jews and Christians, which is that we're not to disbelieve or believe in it because of any particular point, but only to say that there is the word of God has been contained in it. Whether that has been correctly and fully and authentically transmitted is a different question, but there has been things that survive of original teaching. And so we have that respect for it. And of course, where we are told to consult the people of the book, well, they consult really just to verify certain things, which in terms of a debate with these polytheists who are saying, who's this prophet claims to be, from the tradition of Abraham and so on. How do we know this? And then they say, well, go ask the Jews and Christians on certain things that he's mentioned and see if it's brand new, he just invented it, or you cannot find it in their text. So this is where the context. It doesn't mean that all their text is accurate and uncorrupted. So this is again a narration by the Prophet Muhammad himself on the matter. Whereas again we see, as I said, in the Bible, in the New Testament, Paul himself at one point writes, "I say this and not God." But if the whole Bible is the Word of God, and the Word of God contains a part that says, this is from me and not God, that produces a very fundamental theological contradiction. And as for the issue of the authenticity of the Quran, I mean, this is a whole other discussion. There's no later development in it. All Muslims agree in the cohesiveness of the text from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Reason being is because Muslims mass memorized the Quran, and we recite the entire Quran every single Ramadan, as well as for our prayers. We recite different verses for our prayers. So collectively, en masse, Muslims mass memorized as well as mass wrote the Quran, and we don't see any scriptural differences. We don't see any variants that you get that you certainly would get in Christianity today.
Sadly, not true, but that's a discussion for another time.
Another time, then. Well, I'll have it gladly.
Sorry, I just want to conclude this section, if I may.
Yeah.
This second of our 3 sections by asking you, Andy, one final thing.
Yes.
We know, I think now, how Muslims regard Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
How do you regard the Prophet Muhammad?
Oh my word! What a remarkably good question. I think the mistake Christians can fall into here is being rude, and I don't think we should. So I think I regard Muhammad as a man who, perhaps early on, was perhaps genuine. We know if we take the earliest biographies we have of Muhammad in Islam, there's a historical problem there because of the time gap, 150 to 200 years. But let's just go with them for a moment. We have a man who was drawn to aesthetic and spiritual interests, who would go out to the desert meditating and pondering on things, and I think gets it into his head that he is a prophet. And so there's early sort of material he begins preaching in his early days in Mecca, pretty low-key, the stuff he was saying, still enough to get himself into trouble. Then when he's chased out of Mecca and runs up to Medina and gets into political power, that's where the problems begin. And that's where I think actually I'm more cynical at that point. But still, I think you can explain Muhammad this way, as saying Muhammad was a man who was deeply, deeply committed to his people, the Arabs. He looks up to the north and the east. He sees the Zoroastrian. He sees the Persians, great empire. They have a religion, Zoroastrianism. Looks to the north and the west. You have the Byzantines, great empire. They have a religion and a book. He gets it into his head that the way to unify his people is to give them a religion and to give them a book. And he does a darn good job of doing that. And I think when you explain it, look at Islam through that lens, it actually begins to answer a lot of the critical questions. The change in the nature of the revelations in Medina, the way that ideas are picked up and borrowed, the strange theme that politics plays as you go through there, and also some of the early controversies in early Islam as well. And don't get me wrong, Abdullah and I disagree on a lot of things, but I think
Andy, would you therefore
thing to study.
Sorry to interrupt you. Andy, would you therefore say to all Christians, read the Quran because it's worth reading, because you will learn things from it to your advantage? Or do you say, don't bother, not necessary?
I certainly think if you are going to engage in conversations with Muslim friends, that's why I began reading it, why I learned Arabic, why I did spend 7 years doing a PhD in Quranic origins. You don't need to go all down that rabbit trail. But if you are going to talk to Muslim friends, then I would suggest that's a great way to do it. And also, the Quran's not an easy book. So the one way into that, let me give you one tip. If you've got a Muslim friend listening to this, and this will go for Christians too. If you're a Christian with a Muslim with a Christian friend, why not get together if you're a Christian with your Muslim friend and say, why don't we do a Quran and Bible study? Invite your Muslim friend to bring their favorite Quran verse. You can bring your favorite Bible verse. Grab a coffee together and talk about the text that you've brought, because that gets you the mistake. And Abdullah and I are both guilty of this. We get into this: who's right, who's wrong? Let's go for the critical scholarship piece, and that's fun and it's important. But actually, for most people who haven't got the time to do that, let's relate to one another as people who deeply believe things. Let's listen to why we believe them. And then as Christians, let's share the love of Christ within there. That's a great way to get introduced to the Quran. Ask your Muslim friend to tell you what it means to them and why. And you tell them what the Bible means to you and Jesus means to you.
Well, we'll just have to take a break then. I want to pick up on those thoughts about the way in which we can and people can cooperate. If you're interested in all of this, please do. And if you're enjoying today's conversation, do hit the subscribe button so as not to miss more debates and discussions. And I'd love to know what you think on this topic too. So please do send us your thoughts, send your questions. Our email is unbelievable@premier.org.uk. And don't forget, you can follow us on Instagram @PremierUnbelievable, where we regularly drop updates and opportunities for you to have your say about upcoming programs. You're listening to me, Roger Bolton, and we're talking about what it means to be a Muslim and a Christian and how we should relate to each other. Be back in a moment.
Are you saying that no one is really an atheist deep down?
I didn't say no one was. I said that most of the people who claim to be atheists aren't.
My response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it.
The first part of that is nihilistic and the second part isn't. So how do you reconcile those two things?
But humanism is grounded in our universal humanity, the fact we're made of the same stuff. We're the same species. We all are sentient.
I don't doubt that many of my atheist friends are committed to human dignity or human equality. I can't see, as it were, where the deep foundations for that are.
Nature is awash in purposes. They emerge from the bottom up, from a purposeless process. That's the genius of Darwin's idea.
That's a heroic project.
It is.
It is, but I don't think it's a possible one.
Something that makes us connect with that thing that is outside of ourselves. I can't put a name on that or call it God.
That experience of an encounter with the reality of the resurrected Christ was life-changing.
Welcome back to part 3. I'm your host, Roger Bolton, and I've been very much enjoying this discussion about the relationship between Muslims and Christians, and how in this section we're going to discuss how we can cooperate perhaps in the future, because if we don't, there's plenty of evidence around about the terrible consequences of that. And just getting into this final section, though, I want to just start at the end if we can. One thing I didn't mention earlier is the view of, again, which I think Muslims and Christians share, Abdullah, that there is a final judgment, that there is a heaven and hell. And I know Muslims believe in the reality of Satan.
Yes.
So could you just expound for us what that final judgment will be? Christians obviously would understand central to that judgment will be whether one believes in Christ. What's central to the judgment day as far as Muslims are concerned?
Sure. Well, I would say that one of the most important principles for salvation is sincerity to the truth. One of God's names is Al-Haq in the Quran. It means the truth. And anyone who prizes the truth truly above all things and seeks sincerely to follow it, even against the biases they were taught, or they heed the contradictions they notice in the stories they're told in their locality, and try to transcend it, to seek the truth sincerely, will be saved. And the Quran talks about even those of Jews and Christians who are sincere and try to follow the truth, do not make partners to God, as in they worship other things alongside God, but they worship God alone. It says in the Quran that on that day of judgment they will not grieve. But when we have the final messenger of the Prophet Muhammad, and once one becomes aware that he is the final messenger and prophet, it is obliged to accept all of God's prophets as soon as you become aware of them. And you have to heed them, you have to believe in them. So as a Muslim, we certainly believe in all the prophets. And we certainly affirm them, that they are prophets and messengers of God, and we affirm our love for them, and we believe in Jesus. We affirm our love for him, and we believe in him as the Messiah as well. So this is what is important for salvation. And I think this parallels, again, the same discussions, which is in the alleged teachings of Jesus in parts of the New Testament, where a woman, I think, approaches him and asks him what is necessary for salvation, and that it is to believe that he is the Messiah. And so we affirm this. The difference is of course whether one needs blood atonement and human sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin. We believe that God is perfectly merciful and perfectly forgiving, and that he can do things which humans can't do. So he can forgive, and he's generous, but humans can't forgive and God not be able to forgive, right? So of course that would be ridiculous. So if we can forgive people who transgress against us, then God can forgive without requiring a punishment those who transgress against him. And we believe in an abundantly merciful God, The most often name recited is in the Quran, Ar-Rahman, the merciful. And this is, we believe, is the pathway to salvation is obviously through God's mercy and his forgiveness if one approaches him in a penitent way. But as I said, for those people who do become aware of a prophet of God and choose to reject that prophet with insincerity, and God knows truly who are the sincere and who are the insincere, then of course they can't avail themselves of salvation. And it's the same concept actually even in Christianity. There'll be people coming up to Jesus, and he says on their judgment, they'll say, Lord, Lord, and he says, he turns away from them like, I know you not. Right? They even said, Lord, Lord, we did miracles in your name. They actually even apparently did miracles in his name, and he will turn away from them. So I know you not. So sincerity, I think, is a key underlying principle for salvation. Sincerity to the truth, pursuit of the truth, and accepting it once one becomes aware of it.
Abdullah, thank you very much. Could I move back to, in our final section, to how we're to live together and move forward? Andy, you were talking about, as it were, what we individually on a local level can do. But there is a large question, perhaps, that we should address, which is some people have maintained that, in a sense, we can only live together in some form of liberal democracy. What we can't do is accept that there should be, as it were, a Christian state or an Islamic state, because both to a degree would put unfair restraints on others who need to come to their understanding of God of their own will, free will. Is that something you agree with? That, for example, that in the end, and we'll get on to the question probably of Islamic law and so on, is that we have to accept, both Christians and Muslims have to accept this idea, give up the idea, if we are, of a state which was in any way cease to enforce a particular belief on anyone.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, we've covered a lot of ground and differences, and my word, the list of things, if we had time to explore, would be a lot of fun. But I think one thing where I think there is some common ground is that in one sense, actually, both the history of both Islam and Christianity tell the same lesson, that when religion and politics get together, things go badly wrong. Many of my Muslim friends, I think, do sort of look back to the kind of golden age of Islam, the time of the first four caliphs. That's often talked about through kind of rosy-coloured eyes. And okay, there are some historical questions, but put that to one side. But what happens, I think, is certainly once, in the case of Islam, once Islam gets out of Arabia and the periods of the imperial conquests begin, it gets quite messy and quite nasty right down to the end of the Ottoman Empire. And, you mentioned Islamic State. There are many, many parts of the world today. If you look at the lists put out by Human Rights Watch and others of places where religious freedom is at the most limited, it is places where those in power who are Muslim have decided, let's get hold of the levers of power and use it. I don't think it needs to be that way. I want to be fair to Abdullah. I don't think it has to be that way, but it has been that way. Christians should share that sympathy, because I think we should say, well, for the first 300 years, when Christianity was in minority and persecuted by the Roman Empire, it was a kind of a movement coming up from below. When the Christian church grew from being 120 men and women just up before the day of Pentecost to 50% of the Roman Empire over those first 300 years, and it did it without going near the levers of power. That was an amazing time period. Then it's easy to make him a whipping boy when Constantine gets his hands on the thing, and we had that problem of politics and power coming together. The challenge, of course, for Islam is Muhammad really was playing around with politics back then. But I would say yes to your question. If we can, as people of faith, realize that getting faith tangled up with the levers of power to be an influence, absolutely. I think in a liberal democracy like the UK, it's important that Christians and Muslims have a voice at the table. Once we start thinking we should run the table, it doesn't end so well. And for me, by the way, the model, of course, of that was Jesus, who I don't think you can read the New Testament and take seriously somebody who had, as a Christian, I believe, all the power in the universe, who did not use it to victimize others, but was willing to become a victim. If that, as a Christian, is not my model for how I go about civic engagement with those who are very different to me, something has gone badly wrong.
Abdullah, can I ask you directly then, do you think that Muslims, I know Muslims accept that whether in a minority, obviously they should not attempt to introduce an Islamic state, but do you think that an Islamic state is an ideal state to which everyone should aspire?
Well, firstly, as I mentioned, political philosophy is one of my one of my special interests, and so we've crossed into a very interesting discussion. But I will keep it brief as I can. So the issue is that secularism is a recent invention in the West, and it came through disagreements, arguments, and persecutions between Protestants. Actually, not vis-a-vis the Catholic Church, but actually, ironically, between Protestants. Calvinists and Lutherans and others were very intolerant of each other and viewed the state as a means to enforce Christian doctrines on the Christian communities that they were their subjects. So this is where liberalism was invented. But I would say that the problem here is not so much the mixing of religion and politics, quote unquote. The ancient world had no different distinction between these concepts. The ancient world, it was very simply your way of life, your belief, your being righteous and just are all one and the same thing. The law and religion is the same thing. The Torah literally means law, right, in Hebrew and also in Arabic. So there's no distinction. That Moses ruled as a prophet ruler. Likewise, there were prophets that came, obviously David, Solomon, alayhi salam, prophet rulers. They ruled with what? Secular law, liberalism? No, they ruled with the commandments of God. And of course, when Christians got into power, and we really had in the later Roman Empire, there was some confusion amongst Christians because some say that many scholars will argue that they actually didn't anticipate to have been so long still existing before the second coming. They thought the second coming would come within the generation of Paul. So the kind of Christians getting into politics was almost an accident, and it wasn't intended to. But then Christians started to open up the Bible for guidance, as Christians are told to do. What does the Bible say? All scripture is God-inspired and useful for teaching. So they took that principle and they went Old Testament on politics to some extent, mixed it with some Germanic laws, some Roman laws, and they came up with, I suppose, what you might call, a European history under Christian with Christian laws. We had the law for blasphemy, against blasphemy, to blaspheme the Trinity in England up until only just maybe 2 decades ago, right? So it's actually really recently it was repealed. But I want to get to a very important point here, and I'll discuss.
Oh, sorry, if I may interrupt.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by that history,
Yeah.
and I don't want to quibble with it. You know far more than I do, but I still want to ask you that basic question: do you think an Islamic state is the ideal state to which Muslims should aspire?
I think in the Muslim world, certainly, where Muslims should aspire to an Islamic-based sovereignty over themselves in their lands, of course. But the reason being, why it's very important.
And what about when? Sorry to interrupt again. Yeah. And what about where they are a significant minority, but a minority? Do you say that to them they should participate in the political structures as they exist, or they should work towards an Islamic state?
Well, what I would say is that for Christians and Jews, certainly there is a lot of overlap and similarities with the law in Islam, and certainly Jews were very comfortable under Islamic ruling. But there is a misconception which history bears quite testament against, and that misconception is that Jews and Christians are under the Sharia or they're under Islamic law. They're not. Right, we're not going to make a Jewish person or a Christian person a more righteous Muslim by subject them to Islamic law, even though there's not that much differences between Islamic law and Mosaic law. So we saw that like for example, there was a report of a traveler going through 10th century Iraq, Islamic Iraq, under an Islamic caliphate, and they saw Christian towns and pig farms and wineries, and I was like, oh, well, this is they noticed this, but it was almost like normal because Christians were not expected to outlaw drinking wine or eating pork, because they follow their religion that they believe allows that. Some Christians don't, like Seventh-day Adventists don't do that. But it was the Islamic principle was non-interference in people's internal communal life, even to the point of having their own courts. So Christians would have Christian courts, Jews would have Jewish courts, and this was a degree of latitude that you don't even see in the West.
No, but you're talking about 1,000 years ago, and we're not suggesting now, and it'd be very difficult to think how we could have a set of separate laws that applied to people within this country depending on their faith. I mean, obviously there are certain Jewish courts in existence now, and certain elements of Muslim law applies in certain cultural areas, but overall, there has to be surely a single law to which all can operate within to the maximum degree of freedom. But of course, an Islamic state is not like that. And I'm just intrigued to know whether you think that Muslims should work to that ideal.
Well, firstly, the last Islamic state was over 100 years ago, which was the Ottoman Caliphate. And the Ottomans had a millah system, which was quite famously a system that allows autonomy for different religious communities to have their own courts and to have their own law, and even to have their own police force to enforce their own laws upon their own community. So this was the kind of autonomy that you had, and it is viable for 100 years later to have different communities having that autonomy to live by their own laws and have their own law courts. Because one law for all is an imposition of the majority.
Abdullah, if I may interrupt, but Abdullah, a lot of people were saying, in the end, you have to have universal laws. There are areas where perhaps in our personal behavior, it's appropriate for different religious communities to behave in certain ways. But overall, as a community, we have to have a set of laws which everybody agrees to. They have to be universal. Now, and if we don't have that, how are we to live together?
Well, then, I think that's really easily answered. The fact that you basically have a lot of things which overlap, like don't commit murder, don't steal, for example, as just basic things, right? Just to give those examples. And we all agree on that. And so in an Islamic state or in a caliphate system, which is the Islamic system, the only Islamic system, not like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Iran or any of these, or Turkey, which are either modern day kingdoms or secular systems. An Islamic caliphate was one where you'd have laws which would apply to everybody, which in terms of like don't steal and don't murder, what have you, and then you'd have each community having its own law system and that autonomy. So you can have that system. It was successfully implemented. It was a laissez-faire approach to people practicing. Whereas in England, for example, even when you had arbitration courts, voluntary religious arbitration courts that were introduced, and even then they don't overrule a judge in a court system, and you had people crying about Sharia law taking over our country. And of course, 70, 80 years ago, they talked about, papal law taking over our country, or even 150 years ago. And then 100 years ago was Jewish law taking over our country, just because you have minorities that want to have that voluntary adjudication tribunals, or not tribunals, just really kind of somewhat not really a court system, but just an adjudication system. So I think the real issue is, can the West be as tolerant as Islam is to its minorities? Can it give the same latitude? Can it give the same latitude?
Well, Andy, I wonder what to do now. But can you clearly disagree? Could I ask you, as we move towards the final section, though, of two things, really?
Yes.
One is the way in which Muslims and Christians can increasingly at least understand each other. And then the broader question that affects both, which is the world with AI and all those developments, and with the decline, certainly, in faith in many areas of the world. The argument is to persuade anybody out there that religion is still central to life. Let's take the first of those, which is Christians and Muslims and what they can do together. And the first thing that occurs to me is how ignorant so many of us are about the other faith. And we have a situation in our schools in this country where religious education is never that wonderful, to be honest, and is now dropping further and further down the syllabus and dropping off in certain areas, or is taught by people who aren't actually particularly interested in it. Do you think there's a fundamental job to be done in terms of religious education in this country, so that at least we can understand what each other thinks? Andy?
Well, Roger, thank you for asking that question. And actually, it's timely, having just come off a sort of 3-week tour where I've done about sort of 8 or 9 schools, I think, in the last 3 weeks. And often, what's interesting, because I have the background I do, I often get asked to come in and teach comparative stuff, which is fascinating. Whether it's the difference between the Christian view of heaven and the Islamic view of heaven. We were doing some history in one class the other week, actually. So I was interested that you mentioned the Ottoman Empire, and we had a class where we got into things like the Armenian genocide and all those kind of pieces, which has been somewhat buried, which is interesting. So I think, but what's interesting, the common theme, I would say, Roger, is that almost every RS, religious studies teacher I spoke to, and I think in the set there were some Christian ones, one Muslim one, and a few kind of secular humanists. You get an interesting mixed bag of people who teach RS. The kind of universal thing I heard was that they really feel a bit of despair, actually, in that religious studies is increasingly seen as a sort of poor second cousin in the overall field of the humanities. And I think that's a shame. And the reason I think it's a shame is the world is getting more religious, not less religious. If you look at the data out of a research organization like the Pew Forum, it points out that by 2050, I think it is, the world is going to be roughly 1/3 Christian, 1/3 Muslim, quite a lot of other things in there as well. But what's interesting, the number of atheists and humanists is in decline. It's going down for a whole number of reasons. It's a complex picture. So the world is getting more religious. So, i.e., there is a very strong argument that if you want to understand the modern world, we need young men and women coming out of our schools and our universities knowing how to think about religious questions, knowing how to understand religion, knowing how to engage with those who think differently. Otherwise, you literally cannot understand the modern world. And then the other thing I think that's happening at the same time, Roger, we're seeing this trend where there's great shifts happening. There's the great shift in terms of conversion patterns from Islam. Like the fastest growing church in the world now is the Iranian church. It's mind-boggling to get your head around the fact there are 1 million Iranian Christians out there. You read a book like Wind in the House of Islam to see those statistics. You see the huge interest in spirituality beginning again in the West. Now, I think both Abdullah and I would agree, spirituality with a lowercase s, I think both of us would raise some eyebrows over. But when I go onto university campuses now, I meet very few new atheist type skeptics. I've written on the new atheism. You've covered new atheism on Unbelievable, but you're seeing a lot more younger people, those under the age of about 30, say, I think there must be something going on. I wonder what it is. And I think there's a real need to be wading into those questions. So I would be a massive advocate for religious studies being increased in our schools, done really, really well, so that young people are prepared for the big questions of life and for what's going on in the world. And yes, that religious studies needs to make sure that it thinks about what all the different faiths say and explores the differences. And it was interesting seeing young people get excited about the differences between Islam and Christianity. I taught the material from my book on the differences in God in many, many schools over the last 3 weeks. And it was interesting, the discussions that started.
Abdullah, do you think that the Muslim communities in this country have got a big decision to make? And my own experience, it's obviously limited when I was a producer of programs and so on, is that there are quite significant numbers of Muslims in this country who basically wanted to be left alone, did not want to participate and get out into the wider discussion. To an extent, it was difficult, for example, when I worked at the BBC, to find people who wish to work as producers in the BBC who were Muslim. Do you think that there's a real need now for Muslim communities in the UK to be much more outgoing and to engage a great deal more, because you are so misunderstood by so many?
Well, I think that the misunderstandings against Muslims in this day and age, in England, for example, and a few other European countries, very much parallels the misunderstandings against Jews 100 years ago, 120 years ago, if not earlier. And that really is that the perception of this separate community with its own practices, which are deemed to be un-Christian, and a potential fifth column with their own loyalties. And so what you get is, if Muslims are separate, or they try to keep themselves to themselves, they're accused of being isolationist and not wanting to integrate. And then if they do actually try to get involved with politics and campaigning, they're told that they're trying to take over the system. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. But I think that one of the key issues is the abhorrence of religion in its involvement in politics, but people viewing these two things as should be separate things. Religion, or you might call your belief about your way of life, or what have you, involves what is good and bad, a discussion of good and bad. Good and bad should underpin politics, just and unjust should underpin politics. And if we detach religion from politics, then what you get is a politics which is motivated by pure material, cynical pursuit of power, interests, and of course things which are going to be unjust, are going to be sinful, are going to be bad, are going to be very, very horrible. And this is the thing. This is the issue: is that religion has become irrelevant because people support secularism. If you say the Bible is a good guide for all mankind, for all things, and then you say, oh, but we don't want to put it here because it's going to cause trouble in politics, then you yourself are admitting that the Bible is deficient. And this is the message that goes out to kids. People say, what's the point of even learning religion? It's pointless. It has no relevance to our life. We have these secular concerns. We have materialistic concerns that can motivate us.
So are you arguing not just for engagement, a wider engagement for all believers, but also that they ought to be more open about their beliefs and the value in their view of your view in those beliefs? Today, a lot of people are, the old arguments were, Alistair Campbell famously said we don't do religion, and other people say, well, hold on, religion is a private matter. But what you're saying, I think very clearly, and I'm sure Andy agrees, is that it can't be a private matter since it's the most important thing in your life. But are you then saying, Abdullah, that actually people should not be as reticent about proclaiming their beliefs?
Well, I mean, more so that they should be, advocating for the social mores of their beliefs into society. I'm sure Andy Bannister is aware of the education issues where children are taught that, for example, same-sex couples are an equally more valid form of family structure as any other. And that's because the state has to be secular, secular has to be neutral, and so it can't adopt a position on that. And that means that then kids who should have access to equal education should be taught that. That's the secular logic that would teach kids that, which I'm sure he opposes. If you want to counter that, you have to be active and say, well, actually, I do have a worldview. This worldview is shared by many others. And in this case, Jews and Christians would agree on this. And that you don't have to be scared of religion and politics, because as long as you adopt a principle, and this is actually in a sense also an Islamic principle. In fact, I'd say Islam came before secular Europe did, which is there's no compulsion in religion or belief. This is a verse of the Quran. There's no compulsion in belief, or in religion rather. So in this sense, the state does not force people to adopt a particular creed, whether it's if you're a Christian state, a particular interpretation of the Bible. Or a particular creed, Christianity or Islam, what have you. It doesn't force convert them into that. If we agreed to that, it's okay to live under laws that might not be the laws from your religion per se. I mean, if there was a devoutly Christian state that wasn't going to force me to leave Islam or persecute me for being a Muslim, I don't think I'd have a problem with that, right? And vice versa should also be the case.
Abdullah, trying to pick up that point. I can understand you saying the state, in your view, should not pronounce on whether, for example, same-sex marriage should be regarded in the same way as, shall we say, heterosexual marriages. But are you then saying the state should have but the state cannot have no position? It can make sure that people who disagree with that view are able to express themselves, but ultimately a state has to take a view about who is married and who is not. So I don't understand ultimately how the state can dodge certain issues.
Well, I mean, it could argue very simply that kids who from families that don't believe in that same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples are more or less the same kind of relationship structure. That they don't believe in that they should be taught that against their will, or they should be forced upon them by an education
If I may
system.
say necessarily about what is taught, it is what the law says. For example, on a specific point of the legality or otherwise of homosexuality, our society as a whole has taken the view that it will no longer a long time ago taken the view society will no longer regard homosexuality has been anyway, if you like, less worthy than heterosexuality. Now, that offends certain Christians, it offends certain Muslims, but the state has taken that view. I can't see what the alternative is unless you're supposing or unless you're arguing that a particular religious view should be enshrined in law, which would be the case in an Islamic state, is not the case in a liberal democratic one. So are you arguing? I'm not sure what you're arguing for. Are you
Sure.
saying people should be able to behave as they want and the state shouldn't say anything on these matters, or what?
Well, it depends the context. So if we're talking about a Muslim majority country, or we're talking about, let's say, England. So in a Muslim majority country, then Islamic law would have a position on this. And in fact, homosexuality itself, the term, was only a recent invention in the late 19th century. Before that, there was no term to discriminate people who just had certain tastes. To create a community out of it, almost to politicize and create this new category. And once you discriminate a category, then discrimination began. Whereas in Islam, we don't have a category that separates people into their sexual preferences, nor does an Islamic system.
We may not have a category, but we clearly have people of a homosexual inclination have not only suddenly arrived on this planet in the year 2000. I mean,
again, it was the early Muslims were aware of this. We have narrations by the Prophet Muhammad where this is not a brand new thing that we never heard of before, but rather. What is punished in Islamic law is people who basically have intercourse in public. Whatever you do in the privacy of your own home is between you and God. This is an Islamic principle. But if you try to influence society by basically publicizing it, i.e., just sleeping in public with somebody, which admittedly is something that people generally don't do, but by and large, then that's the only thing that is punished. It's in essence, public lewdness, which to a degree is also punished in this country as well, actually. But the issue is that there's this fear, and I see implicit in what you're saying is this fear that, and a misperception, a misapprehension that Islam is something that would persecute minorities and so on. And no, it doesn't. And I know that Andy mentioned the Armenian genocide that happened in 1915 or maybe a couple of decades earlier, depending on how you want to cite it, would notably happened when the Turkish state was taken over by secular liberals, the Young Turks, who were Turkish nationalists. Then we saw the treatment of minorities change. When secular nationalism came to the Middle East, that's where you saw minorities mistreated. And I also want to point out that Christianity has been political. Only recently they removed it because they didn't know, in essence, I suppose, how to control Christians who want to interpret the Bible quite in various ways. But the issue is this.
Can I finally get a word in edgeways?
Just to finish my point. Just to finish my point, which is, I mean, this is a matter of historical record, but to finish my point is that you can't say that Jesus was apolitical or that he will be apolitical, because it says in the book of Revelation, which you've cited, that basically when he comes back, he will massacre disbelievers. He will, as a colleague of mine once said, no more Mr. Nice Guy. When he comes back, he will rule with power as a leader, commanding armies, and he will, massacre those who disbelieve in him. It's in the book of Revelation. It's quite heavy-handed, I might say. So, the Christianity has had a problem with understanding where its place is in politics. But please don't project that onto other belief system, worldviews, what have you, who never had a problem understanding the connection, the intrinsic connection between what is universally morally declared as good and bad by the creator of the universe and how humans affairs, that humans' purpose in life and humans' affairs in life are not separate, they are connected. And that is the Islamic message as well as the Jewish message as well. And depending on which denomination of Christianity you follow, it can be the Christian message too.
Andy, you want to come back?
Oh, my word, so much in there. I mean, it's a rather saccharine view of history. I just simply encourage people, by the way, on the Armenian genocide, go look up on that. I think the idea that throughout Islamic history, Islam has proceeded along a line of going, you can behave as you like entirely, in the privacy of your own home, and there'll be no problem. I think, again, I can just see the sort of jaw dropping on the desks of scholars of Islam around the world. That has not been the case. It's never been the case. It wasn't really even the case in the beginning. Once Muhammad gets into political power in Medina, very quickly, those who were on a different side to him. And it's interesting, by the way, we haven't got time to discuss it now, but as Abdullah will know, the relationships between the Muslim community and the Jewish one have been difficult from the beginning, because when the Jewish tribes there in Medina refused to acknowledge that Muhammad was a prophet in the line of Moses, it ended with bloody beheadings and effectively a genocide. But that's a discussion for another time. And of course, Islamic Spain, where your name comes from. It's very interesting if you look at the history of dimitude, the idea that yes, you could be a Jew or a Christian and an Islamic state, but you paid a head tax. The jizya was a tax that was paid. And by the way, I mentioned Mark Dury's book earlier. Look up Mark Dury's book, The Third Choice. Encourage readers to Google Mark Dury, Durie. Third Choice looks at the history of Jews and Christians under Islam. So, Roger, your point, I think, is a really, really good one.
Well, sorry, but I should only, in fairness, say at this point that anybody who studies the Crusades can see how the Christians behaved to Jews and Muslims in a quite appalling manner. So, sorry.
By the way, on the Crusades, if I might make a point since you've raised it. Absolutely. And of course, the interesting thing is, one of my challenges here that I often make to Muslim friends, and I won't make this to Abdullah now because we'll have another 5 or 10 minutes, because both he and I can talk a lot. But here's the question. As a Christian, I would stand here and say, yes, I condemn the Crusades. Yes, there were political reasons for them, and we can explore that. But on a whole, whichever lunatic got the idea that painting the cross, the symbol of peace, on military hardware and then marching across a military adventure to retake the Holy Land, killing people along the way, quite frankly, it was a travesty. But here's the challenge. As a Muslim, are you equally willing to condemn the expansion that happened, particularly under the second caliph and onwards, where Islam expanded out of Arabia and conquered vast amounts of territory? And the historical work's been done on that. We have the accounts of people at the time who suffered under that. And I think it's important that both Christians and Muslims are willing to look at their own history. The Crusades, for us, perhaps those early Islamic conquests, there. The question, though, Roger.
Let me put then briefly to Abdullah. Are you prepared to accept that essentially that the faith, your faith, was spread by the sword?
That wasn't what I was saying, Roger.
Sorry, forgive me. Forgive me. Just respond to what he said rather than what I said, Abdullah.
Yeah.
The Islamic conquests, which deposed the Roman Empire, imperial control of North Africa and Spain, as well. Spain wasn't controlled at that point. As well as the Persian imperial control. No, of course, I wouldn't condemn that. I think it was actually a very good thing. It changed the Middle East very positively. It lightened the taxes that were on the people. It gave people actual an autonomy. The Jews celebrated the Muslims coming in to liberate Islamic Spain, and there was no Portugal back then. Islamic Hispania, which is the Roman imperial word for that territory, because they were under severe sanction by Christians in the Iberian Peninsula, under the Visigoths. So there was, of course, there were Arab Christians actually who celebrated the coming of Arab Muslims into the Roman imperial provinces in Syria and so on and so forth. We have actually historical records where they actually praised the conquerors, said that they actually have it better than they did under the Romans. So again, I said, look at the history, and I would disagree with Andy on a number of things, but I'll just mention just two small points. One is the idea that the Prophet Muhammad punished people for what they did inside their own homes is completely false. We have narrations where someone came up to the Prophet Muhammad saying, "I've committed adultery, punish me," and the Prophet Muhammad didn't want to hear about it, and he chided his friend who told him to come and confess, saying, "If only you'd kept it secret and not announced it publicly to the world, then God could have forgiven you for this. You've repented, but now you've made it public knowledge, and you're insisting on being punished for it. Then, of course, this is to be punished only because the guy wanted to be punished for this." Or drunkenness. The Caliph Umar radiallahu anhu, who's the second leader of the Muslims, famous story. He saw someone drinking inside their own home. He peered over a wall and saw it, and he said, you should be ashamed of doing this and deserve punishment for it. And the person said, "Now you should be ashamed for breaching my privacy." And in essence, Caliph Umar said, "Okay, I'll drop it if you drop it," basically, because the person had a right to privacy, and the Caliph of the Muslims couldn't actually impinge on that. So that's demonstrably false what Andy said, that Islam doesn't respect the right to privacy.
Well, I think that,
and lastly, as for the Jewish tribes, it's very important. There was no genocide on Jewish tribes in early Islam at all whatsoever.
Well, I know there's a big argument. Sorry, we'll never resolve that. Certainly there's a real disagreement. But we've ended up a long way. Actually, we've ended up, in a sense, differing or focusing on difference. We started off, I hope, also indicating how much was in common. But what presumably we all agree on is it's dangerous to be ignorant of either Christianity or Islam. And therefore everyone should read the Quran and the Bible, because at least if we disagree on the basis of understanding and knowledge, that's something. Disagreeing on the basis of ignorance is a prescription for a nightmare. So am I just summarizing correctly, Andrew, to say that one of the things, if people are listening for this, you would say to them is read the Quran?
Absolutely. And you heard me put that in the context of read the Quran in a friendship. The Quran is a very difficult book to read. Something like, even Muslim scholars themselves have acknowledged that something like sort of 45 to 50% of the Arabic we're not entirely clear around in places. It's not an easy book to read. So the best way to experience it is through a Muslim friend. So I would say go for a coffee with a Muslim friend, ask them to read something, and you read something with them. But your point, though, Roger, I want to underline in terms of trying to understand together. That's why I've spent 25 years engaged in the critical study of Islam, looking at the variations in the manuscripts, looking at the amazingly creative story of how Islam came together. It is far more interesting, actually, when you begin to do that. And the scholarship now is at such an exciting place with what's going on. Some of the digital tools, you mentioned artificial intelligence. I've got a friend working on machine learning and artificial intelligence on variations in Quran manuscripts. We are on the cusp of some really exciting stuff. It is exciting to get into, dig into it. Pursue truth, and then particularly sit down and talk to someone who doesn't believe the same as you.
And Abdullah, what do you say to people who say we don't need to read the Bible because we've got the Quran, it's the final revelation, all we need is the Quran? Would you encourage people to read the Bible?
I would say that all knowledge is useful, all knowledge is illuminating, even if even knowledge of things which are false, like, for example, reading Buddhism or Hinduism or what have you. It always contains a lesson to be learned about human beings and how they think and what they've done and so on. And with the Bible as well, I mean, I became, in essence, my journey to Islam in a way started with the Bible. Looking at Jesus, seeing that he prayed to God, that Jesus said the Father was greater than him, to see that he actually gave a wonderful parable of forgiveness, saying that you should forgive each other. And to be forgiven by God, and all this stuff. When I led me to then when I encountered Islam, I recognized in Islam something that was very, very familiar with this these kernels of teachings which I had been exposed to as a young Christian, and so I would say that it was very important in my journey toward Islam. And I said all knowledge is useful and good. To learn from and guide you to truth. You must only but approach it sincerely and open to seeing these different ideas and perspectives and writings, and then hopefully, with you follow your sincerity and you get rid of your assumptions, God will lead you to the truth.
Well, Abdullah Al Andalusi and Andy Bannister, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'm afraid we've got to leave it there. We'd be most grateful if you would contact us and tell us what you think and the questions you want to be asked. You can do so by going to unbelievable@premier.org.uk or on social media, X @unbelievablefe, or on Facebook and Instagram @Premier Unbelievable. Please rate and review on your podcast provider. It's a huge help to Unbelievable and helps us make more shows like this one. And for now, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much to our guests. I'm off to look at both the Bible and the Quran. Bye-bye.